I'm Jim Baxter, and this is a lecture on energy and ecosystems for general ecology. This image is of a forest bathed in sunlight. I like this image not only because it's peaceful and beautiful, but also because I'm reminded of how important this energy from the sun is for life. You might say it's nature's fuel. It's always been remarkable to me that how plants, through this incredible evolutionary process of photosynthesis, could harvest energy from the sun to drive the production of biomass. As we covered in our discussion of trophic food webs, the energy trapped in these photosynthetic autotrophs supports and is transferred through multiple trophic levels in communities and ecosystems. The amount of energy available in an ecosystem and the efficiency of its transfer from one trophic level to another determine how biomass is distributed across trophic levels and how many trophic levels exist. The amount of energy in an ecosystem also determines how much energy is left over for scavengers, detritivores, decomposers. So I've been using this word ecosystem but haven't yet defined it. So let's do that now. An ecosystem is, there are a variety of different definitions of ecosystems, but an ecosystem is fundamentally an assemblage of ecological communities that are interacting with their non-living physical and chemical environments. In this definition, the ecosystem ecology, that is, deals with the fluxes of energy and movement of materials between biotic communities and the abiotic environments in which they live. Here are the learning objectives for this lecture. I'll let you, as I've done before, take a look at these on your own. For now, let's continue. The starting point for our discussion of how energy moves through ecosystems really must begin with photosynthesis, because this is how energy gets into ecological systems. As a consequence of photosynthesis, producers trap a certain amount of the sun's energy and incorporate it into their biomass. This is shown in the diagram. The proportion of energy from the sun that autotrophs trap in carbon bonds, and hence their biomass, is called assimilation. Some of the energy that is assimilated by producers, as is kind of depicted here in this leaf, is used for new growth and for reproduction. But a large proportion, in fact, about 60% on average, of what is assimilated actually goes into respiration, and we shouldn't forget that plants do respire. Of course, this respiration is required because it's the set of catabolic reactions occurring in the autotroph that releases that stored energy that was captured in photosynthesis in the form of these carbon bonds that can be used for growth and reproduction. This means that about 40% of the absorbed energy, solar energy that is used for net primary production. That is, net primary production represents the actual growth and reproduction of producers. Together, net primary production and respiration constitute what's called gross primary production. Okay. So this is the total production, and it includes production that is due both to net primary production and respiration. So it's important to think about net primary production as energy accumulation in biomass. And I show this picture because this is a trunk of a redwood tree. You might have recognized that already, but redwood trees can grow to more than 370 feet high, have a girth of over 25 feet, and weigh over 2,000 tons. Where did all this biomass come from? Well, of course, all of this biomass was accumulated as a result of photosynthesis. And in a sense, this is sort of the embodiment of net primary production in the form of the trunk, the branches, the leaves, the reproductive structures, and so forth. It's also important to recognize that productivity or primary production, and whenever we talk about productivity, It's actually a rate. So primary productivity is expressed as a rate per unit area over time. The units that are used are varied. It depends. Sometimes productivity is expressed in units of energy like joules or kilojoules per unit area per unit time, oftentimes per square meter or square kilometer, perhaps per year or so forth. But it can also be expressed in units of carbon and even biomass, depending on, kind of what's available to be measured. It's all an accumulation of production. So again, accumulation implying a rate. Carbon is used, and we'll talk about that later, because of course carbon, the amount of carbon that is accumulated or assimilated in productivity is directly related to the amount of energy that has been fixed by autotrophic plants, by photosynthetic organisms. Biomass as well, all of the biomass that is accumulated really can only accumulate because of the energy that is fixed and converted into biomass. So let's look at kind of the productivity equation, if you will. And I've depicted that here as kind of pie charts. And if you recall, gross primary production from that first slide we looked at is the sum. It's the sum total of energy assimilated, that is sort of fixed, maybe in the form of carbon, and so forth, by primary producers over time. Gross primary production is a combination of net primary production and respiration, as we discussed. So that equation there on the bottom, GPP equals NPP plus R, is that simple relationship. If we want to know a net primary production, of course, we can simply rearrange this equation. Net primary production is simply equal to gross primary production minus R. You could kind of think of this as, if you'd like to put it in sort of economic terms, gross primary production would be like your gross pay. R would be taxes, let's say, and NPP would be equivalent to your net income after taxes. Okay, so if you want to think about it that way. But again, getting back to sort of the ecological picture, NPP is really the accumulation of energy in the form of, say, carbon or biomass of organisms. So when we talk about this net production, a net primary production, it's called net primary production because these are, it's production by primary producers, okay? So this energy flow diagram, and you should probably just sort of stare at it for a little while, is a very nice depiction of how energy moves through different trophic levels. And there are 3 trophic levels shown here. There are the producers, okay, and I'll just circle those with a green box. That's what we just talked about, right? So we have energy coming in as light, and you can see that on the left. Some of that energy just never even reaches the plants, so that's that first arrow going down. I have a key on the bottom so you can kind of keep track of terms, but this total light coming in, a portion of it is absorbed by the plant. Okay, some of it's lost by heat. You can see that arrow going downwards for heat. And then we have the gross primary production, GPP, shown there. A portion of that gross primary production, of course, of that energy is lost due to respiration. And then the remainder is net primary production, okay? That PN on the bottom arrow there of 15 is just net primary production. That's what that PN means. And it's just showing sort of a relative amount of energy at each of these different trophic levels. The trophic levels are indicated there as numbers 1, 2, and 3. Number 1 being the producers, and then we have our consumers. the herbivores and carnivores shown here. And the boxes, those two boxes shown one after the other, represent what is called secondary production. Okay, so NPP that's coming out of the producers in that producer box there is being supplied to consumers, and we call this secondary production. Okay, so secondary production, or net secondary production, if we take account of losses due to respiration and energy that is not assimilated by our consumers, the herbivores and carnivores, the rate of that consumer biomass accumulation now is considered net secondary production. So primary production is production of autotrophs. That's where the energy is captured from the sun. That the energy that moves up to consumers through our trophic food web, if you recall, that energy is provided to consumers, and of course there's a fair amount of energy lost in each transition, and this production is referred to as secondary productivity. There's some other terms that I just want to kind of clarify. Your book uses them, but for consumers, when we're talking about secondary production, there's a certain amount of energy that is assimilated by our consumers. This is indicated by a letter A in the diagram. Some of the energy that's from producers, for example, in the form of NPP, is not used. It might be, pieces of woody material, seeds that aren't digested, and so forth. That material can be, some of it can be consumed by consumers, but actually lost because it's excreted or regurgitated or something like that. We call that egested energy. And of course, some of the energy is in our consumers is lost, just like it is in our primary producers through respiration, and we call this respired energy. So that's just simply the proportion of assimilated energy assimilated by the consumer, okay, that's being used for respiration. And of course, there's energy lost at each transition, and I kind of pointed to some of the ways that it's lost. Obviously through respiration, it's not assimilated because it's egested, and so forth. So the more primary production there is, the more secondary production there is. And so what we see is that there is a positive correlation between primary production and secondary production. And that can be seen in these two graphs. The one on the left is the relationship between terrestrial net primary production on the x-axis and terrestrial secondary production on the y. And you can see that they're positively correlated. The same is true in aquatic systems. That graph on the right shows the same relationship in aquatic systems. So this is a typical sort of bottom-up model, right? So more primary production results in more secondary production. In other words, more production of herbivores that subsequently would pass on more energy to carnivores and so forth to support higher trophic levels. So let's talk about how productivity is measured, in particular primary productivity. There are a number of different ways that productivity can be measured. They differ by whether we're measuring productivity in a terrestrial system or an aquatic system. I'm going to focus on one method in particular in terrestrial systems, but there's a parallel method in aquatic systems. I'll focus on the CO2 method. The corresponding method for aquatic systems is the oxygen method, and it essentially works in the same way because CO2 and oxygen, both these methods are related to photosynthesis, and so CO2 and oxygen are stoichiometrically related in the photosynthetic equation, so they're really equivalent. In terrestrial systems, of course, we can measure productivity. I mentioned, productivity is biomass accumulation. So that's done very routinely in field situations where simply changes in the amount of producer biomass is measured. So we can just simply harvest biomass accumulation, measure it over time and over area, and come up with measures of the amount of production of above ground biomass or even below ground biomass if roots and other underground structures are harvested, which of course is much more difficult, but can be done. There are remote sensing techniques as well for both terrestrial and aquatic systems, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let's take a look at the CO2 method first, that's used in terrestrial systems. So remember that carbon fixation is directly related to the amount of energy that's assimilated by plants through photosynthesis, which is why primary production is often measured in units of carbon assimilated into the plant per unit area and per unit time. In the lab and in the field, net primary production can be determined by measuring exchange rates of carbon dioxide into and out of the plant leaves, and doing so in the light and the dark. Let's see how this works. To measure carbon dioxide exchange rates in a plant, the leaf of a plant is placed inside of a transparent sealed chamber, as shown here, or a cuvette if it's a real small leaf, and maybe done in the field, and with a light source outside the chamber. Connected to the chamber is an infrared gas analyzer that's shown on the top there. It just shows it as a carbon dioxide analyzer or sensor. That's used to measure CO2 gas and water vapor exchange rates in the leaves inside of the chamber. In the light, or in other words, or during the day, plants of course take up carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and release it through respiration. Because the plant takes up more carbon dioxide through photosynthesis than it releases through respiration, the carbon dioxide concentration in the chamber will decline. The difference in carbon dioxide concentration per unit time represents the net primary production for the plant. Of course, it probably is worth noting that if the plants did not take up more carbon dioxide than it released, well, that would not be a net positive carbon balance for the plant, and of course that would ensure that the plant wouldn't survive. It really, in order to grow and reproduce, it needs to take up more carbon than it loses, more carbon through photosynthesis than it loses through respiration. So that's what's happening in the light. Now, in the dark, or at nighttime, the plant is not photosynthesizing, right? It's respiring, but it's not photosynthesizing. Because of this, the carbon dioxide concentration in the chamber will increase, and this is shown in the right-hand panel. The carbon dioxide concentration in the chamber will increase without any offset by photosynthesis, okay? Because we're just talking about respiration occurring only, okay? So the amount by which CO2 increases in the chamber over that time period represents respiration. So on the left in the light, we're measuring net carbon uptake, which is a measure of net primary production. On the right, we're measuring just respiration. So when we add these together, NPP on the left plus respiration on the right, this gives us gross primary production. With accurate and portable gas exchange instruments available, as well as the development of other sort of very large-scale systems at the entire forest level, these are called eddy analysis systems. Field measurements of NPP can be scaled up to the whole plant and ecosystem scales. So just to kind of recap, and this is just a different way of kind of maybe digesting this method. On the left, we have just a kind of an illustration showing what we're measuring during the daytime, as net CO2 uptake, and it's showing that in the black part of that bar. There's CO2 being taken up and also CO2 being lost. But what we're measuring in terms of the net CO2 difference in the cuvette is net uptake. In the dark, we're measuring respiration because, again, there's no photosynthesis, and all we're seeing in terms of the change in CO2 concentration in the chamber is due to respiration. And of course, that's going to cause CO2 in the chamber to increase. When we add these together, we get gross primary production. Global patterns, as I mentioned, of net primary production can also be measured, both on land and the sea. This color map shows global net primary production that was measured using satellite methods. And this is really cool. One of the things to notice is that NPP varies quite a bit. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes. For now, let's just look at how these data were measured or collected. In oceans and lakes, productivity is strongly correlated with the biomass of photosynthetic organisms, right? Like phytoplankton, for example. Because all photosynthetic organisms have chlorophyll, the amount of reflectance of light off of the chlorophyll molecule in the bodies of these organisms is directly and positively related to the amount of biomass of photosynthetic organisms. In other words, their productivity, okay, in the form of just simply their biomass. On the map, there's a color key for chlorophyll A concentration. That's just one of the forms of chlorophyll. So chlorophyll A concentration on the map in the oceans is based on reflectance of light off of this chlorophyll molecule, or the pigment, in other words. So what you can see is that open oceans have very low productivity, but coastal areas and estuaries where the rivers meet the sea have very high productivity. And the colors on the map for, with high productivity are those in kind of the warmer oranges and reds, okay? So if you stare at this map a little bit, you'll see, like at the mouth of the Amazon, for example, where the Amazon meets the sea, it has very high productivity. Those, the colors there are in the reds, and so forth. In the open oceans, productivity is very much lower. On the land, we use an index called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, and that's a mouthful. For short, we call that NDVI. You might have heard about this before, but NDVI is based on the unique spectral signature of vegetation as measured by satellite imagery. So NDVI is an index that's correlated with productivity, and it's related to reflectance off of vegetation on land. And I don't expect you to memorize this equation or anything, but just to illustrate the concept here, NDVI is based on the difference of near-infrared radiation and visible radiation in the form of this equation. So in the numerator, we have near-infrared minus visible light divided by near-infrared plus visible light. Okay, so it's the difference between near-infrared and visible versus the entire light spectrum. And you can see on the left kind of an example where we have a tree that has its leaves are green, and the near-infrared reflectance of light off of that tree versus visible light reflection. And an equation below it showing how the NDVI for that tree would be calculated with its leaves being green. On the other hand, when trees don't have chlorophyll in their leaves, the reflectance off of those surfaces and also off of land surfaces is very different. And so you can see that the NDVI value is much lower. So we can use this relationship of reflectance of near-infrared and visible light off of vegetation and also off of other surfaces to determine the amount of production of vegetation on land. So if we go back to the map and take a close look at the land areas, you'll notice that there's quite a wide range of productivity in the different biomes, as indicated by NDVI. And we've talked about this a little bit way back when, at the beginning of the class, when we talked about climate. Of course, you remember where the deserts are, I hope. So if you look, of course, like in the Sahara, for example, you'll notice that the colors on land for that area are in the oranges and yellows, and that range represents very, very low productivity. On the other hand, biomes near the equator, such as the Amazon rainforest or tropical Africa, but also in the temperate and boreal areas, like up in the northeastern United States and up into Canada, sort of northern kind of temperate Europe and Russia, you'll see that there are much deeper green colors that indicate that productivity is very, very high in these biomes. So we have a tremendous range of variation, both in the oceans and on land, in terms of the amount of productivity. This is indicated here as well. So in some cases, in some ways, I suppose, this is kind of a recap of what I was just showing you in the form of a map, but ecosystems vary quite tremendously in their net primary production. Some of the highest productivities on land are in tropical rainforests and temperate rainforests, as I just indicated, but also swamps and marshes have very, very high productivity. And in aquatic areas, you can see sort of the range of productivities as well. Open oceans being very low productivity, estuaries being very high, and of course algal beds and coral reefs, tremendously high productivity. So what causes these variations in productivity? Well, productivity is very strongly related to several climatic factors, as you might have guessed. Temperature and precipitation are strong predictors, and that's shown here in this graph, showing the relationship between what's referred to as actual evapotranspiration and on the X and net primary production on the Y. And you can see there's a range of different biomes indicated and plotted out on this graph, showing their productivities in relation to this thing called actual evapotranspiration. Okay, so I'll call it AE for short, but AE, or actual evapotranspiration, increases with increasing temperature and precipitation. So AE is you can sort of think of it as the quantity of water that's actually removed from the surface due to processes of both evaporation and transpiration. And remember, of course, transpiration is water loss off the surfaces of plants through their stomata. So AE can kind of be thought of as throughput of water in an ecosystem. In other words, how much water is moving through it. So if there's more water coming into the ecosystem through precipitation and more moving out of the system through evaporation and transpiration, which themselves are influenced by temperature, then AE would be very high. By contrast, if less water is coming into the system, because either or both precipitation is low and evaporation and transpiration are high, then AE would be low. Therefore, AE is really dependent upon and increases with increased precipitation and temperature. So looking at the map, of course, biomes like tropical rainforests, temperate deciduous forests, and so forth, they have very high actual evapotranspiration rates because they both have because they have a very high water throughput. There's a fair amount of water coming into the system and moving through the system. Whereas in deserts and grasslands and things like that, you have both relatively low water inputs. You have low water inputs, and whatever water is there moves out of that system very quickly. So temperature and precipitation are both kind of captured in this AE value, and suggest this strong relationship between how water is moving through the system and net primary production. Net primary production is also increased by increasing nutrients. That's shown here in this slide with some results from Bowman et al., in which they fertilized both dry meadows and wet meadows. You can see in the left panel there are different nutrient additions that were added along the x-axis: a control, a phosphorus alone treatment, a nitrogen alone treatment, a nitrogen plus phosphorus treatment, and this was repeated also in wet meadows. Of course, as you might suspect if you've done any gardening, fertilization, fertilizing your garden increases production. But there are some subtleties here that are worth pointing out. One of the main things to notice is that as nutrients were added, and particularly in combination, you can see that when nitrogen and phosphorus were added together, that produced the greatest production, regardless of whether it was in the dry or wet meadow. Soil moisture increases productivity overall, but it doesn't seem to alter the nutrient response pattern. One of the first things to note is that when nitrogen and phosphorus are added separately, plant growth under the phosphorus alone treatment seems to be limited by nitrogen. And you can see this because as you add nitrogen and phosphorus together, you get a much greater growth response, regardless of whether you're in the dry or wet meadow, compared to when either of those nutrients are added alone. So what we can conclude from this is that adding either of those nutrients, nitrogen or phosphorus alone, what happens is that plants ultimately become limited by the next available limiting nutrient, or the next limiting nutrient. So no matter how much phosphorus is added, as long as nitrogen is still limiting, that's going to limit growth. When nitrogen and phosphorus are added together, that allows for greater growth. This example actually kind of highlights Liebig's law of the minimum, which we discussed earlier, and that is Liebig's law, if you remember, states that plant growth will be limited by the nutrient in least supply. So regardless of whether there's plenty of nitrogen, if phosphorus remains limiting, even though nitrogen might be plentiful, your growth is going to be limited. And these results highlight that. Other studies have shown the same kind of pattern. There was a large meta-analysis study by Elser et al. In 2007 that showed the same types of patterns across terrestrial, marine, and freshwater systems. Lastly, I'd just like to talk about pyramids of energy and biomass. And in general, I'm referring to what are called trophic pyramids. A useful way to think about the distribution of energy or biomass among trophic groups in an ecosystem is by depicting these as a pyramid with the size of any section of that pyramid representing the relative amount of either energy or biomass in each of the trophic groups. When the percentage of total energy is depicted at each trophic level, it's known as an energy pyramid, and that is shown in the left-hand pyramid, the green pyramid here. When the pyramid depicts the relative standing biomass at each trophic level, it's called a pyramid of biomass. And so that's shown on the pyramid in the right, sort of this blue pyramid that as you go up in trophic level, the biomass represented in that trophic level declines. So the pyramid at the top is an energy pyramid because it shows the proportion of total energy available across the trophic levels, and at the bottom it's a standing biomass pyramid. As we talked about in community ecology in that lecture when we talked about trophic food webs, these kinds of distributions of biomass across the trophic levels are a useful model because they can reveal important mechanisms behind the factors that are responsible for determining the distribution of energy or biomass in an ecosystem. Across ecosystems, the shape of energy pyramids are virtually all the same because the energy available at each successive trophic level declines due to energy losses in terms of the transfer of energy from one trophic level to the other. Although this ranges from between 20 to 50% of energy passing on from one trophic level to the next, on average, we see that about 10% of the energy is represented in the next trophic level. Effectively, what this means is about 90% of the energy is lost at each transition from one trophic level to the other. However, one interesting thing that we see is that although energy pyramids are consistent in their shape across terrestrial and aquatic systems, for biomass pyramids, there's an interesting difference in the distribution of biomass between terrestrial and aquatic systems. In terrestrial systems, the greatest portion of biomass occurs in producers, as we've been discussing, and that's consistent also with energy pyramids. For example, in a forest ecosystem, if you might imagine one, producers include obviously trees, shrubs, wildflowers, and so forth, and there's considerably less biomass, and in the primary consumers, such as birds and mammals and insects, and even less at the top predator levels or the top consumer levels, which might include, raptors, owls, carnivorous mammals, and so forth. And this pattern is repeated across terrestrial systems. However, in aquatic systems, the pyramid of biomass is actually inverted. The reason for this has to do with the difference in the types of producers in each case between terrestrial and aquatic systems. In aquatic systems, phytoplankton are the producers. They are small algae that have a very short lifespan and very rapid reproduction. This differs from the primary producers in terrestrial systems, which tend to be much larger organisms, much slower growing. Their consumption by herbivores is much less than in aquatic systems, where in aquatic systems the phytoplankton, these small algae, are consumed in very, very large numbers by consumers in these systems, such as fish and whales and so forth. So although their productivity is much higher than their consumers, that is, the phytoplankton's productivity is tremendously high and much higher than the consumers that are eating them, which would produce an energy pyramid with a wide base, their standing biomass is much lower than that of their consumers. And so for this reason, the difference in biomass distribution creates an inverted pyramid, as indicated in the diagram here. One of the last concepts I just want to put out there, and this will end the slide presentation for this lecture, is that when we talk about the distribution of energy across different trophic levels, and with that energy level declining across from one trophic level to the next, there's a lot of energy lost, of course, as I mentioned, 90% or so. This diagram here doesn't quite represent it in scale, but there's a tremendous amount of energy also that we haven't really talked about, and that is energy that is moving to decomposers and into what we call the detrital food web. The detrital food web is really a major pathway of energy flow. So there's a tremendous amount of biological material, waste products, dead and dying branches and leaves and fruits, but also from herbivorous carcasses and carnivores and things like that are dropped to the ground, the forest floor maybe, or the grassland floor, that become available for detritivores. These are organisms that consume dead organic matter. And so a tremendous amount of the energy that is lost at each of these trophic levels, and energy that doesn't move up through the trophic food web, is moving towards a detritivore food web. And this is an entire food web in and of itself, and a tremendously important one in terms of nutrient recycling and so forth. And we're going to be talking a little bit about detritivores and the detritivore food web, as well as kind of their role in decomposition and nutrient cycling, in our next lecture on movement of materials in ecosystems. So that concludes this lecture on energy in ecosystems. The next lecture will be on movement of materials.